I've been around care for most of my professional life, I suppose. My background's in nursing. I'm a nurse for 16 years. First of all, in the area of mental health, and then in the area of learning disabilities, which was great. That was a real place of formation for me, because when you spend time with people who see the world differently, you begin to see the world differently yourself. And you begin to realise that the way that you assume the world to be is not necessarily the way the world really is. So there's a lot to be learned from sitting with people who are apparently marginalised but actually contain a good deal of truth. And then I worked in chaplaincy for a while. I worked as a community mental health chaplain, working with people with long-term psychiatric conditions who were moving from the institution into society, or into community, as we used to say these days. We used to call it community care. The problem with community care was that there was no such thing as community. And so people would get out of the institution, but they couldn't find a place of acceptance. I mean, it's difficult enough for anybody to find a place of acceptance, a place of belonging, a place of community. If you're perceived as slightly different, then it can be really difficult. So my job was to accompany people as they kind of found their space, a spiritual space in this case, within society. And now, one thing I discovered very quickly there is that when it comes to stigma and alienating attitudes, religious communities can be just as bad as anybody else. So that's obvious, but always kind of disappointing. And then when I wandered into academia in the early 90s, I began to research care. And recently, I've become one of the primary carers for my mother, who's 97 now, living at home. And so I've discovered a new dimension of care, what it means to be a carer face-to-face, as opposed to what it means to be a carer where I'm sitting in my office at work. And it's different, but it's similar. And then there's the Care Commission. We have our first face-to-face meeting on Tuesday in Birmingham. It should be fun. Anyway, today, my job today is to talk about a theology of aging, which basically just means that I'm going to take some basic ideas about God and about how we are before God, place them beside aging, and see what pops up. And when we do that, I think we'll be surprised at what we discover, because I hope we'll be surprised at what we discover. First thing to think about in relation to aging is this. Within contemporary Western society, aging is a highly stigmatised and culturally devalued state. If you think about the way in which people value themselves, what do people value? They value youth, exuberance, competitiveness, power, good job, all of these things that you begin to lose as you get older. Right? So the very things that Western culture values are the very things that begin to drift away from us when we are getting older. And then if you get into the complexities of dementia, it's even worse, because there you begin to lose your mind, or so people would think. Of course, within our culture, your mind, your intellect, your reason is the most important thing for you. The first thing that you say to somebody when you meet them is, what do you do? And then you place them on a hierarchy, which causes real problems when you don't do anything, because we don't really have the capacity to do that. So, it's a culturally devalued way of being in the world. So how do we get value, right? Take something like, I don't know, my wedding ring, right? So my wedding ring doesn't cost very much, but don't tell my wife that. But it's invaluable. Why is it invaluable? Because I put a certain value on it. How do you get your value? You get your value because other people value you. Very few people just get their value because they value themselves. You get your value from your family, from your friends, and in particular friendship. Think about friendship. How do you get friendship? People give it to you. In other words, value is a gift that's given to you. It's not something you can work up because you're clever or not clever, whatever it is. You hand it over, it's something that's gifted to you. And if you're a culturally devalued person or group of people, then things like friendship, things like relationship, things like value begin to be elusive. So you end up with a highly stigmatized perspective. Now, stigma originates from the Greek slave trade, where a slave owner would buy a slave and put a mark on that person. And then from then on, they'd be reduced to the size of that person, the size of that mark, rather. So you no longer be a person, you no longer have a name, you no longer have an identity, you're simply that thing. And that's the way that stigma works. It reduces you to the size of your label. And you can see that a lot in mental health. Diagnoses such as schizophrenia, for example, people suddenly become schizophrenics, whatever that may actually mean. And it's the same in aging. We talk about care of the elderly as if elderly people are like Parisians or Glaswegians or Londoners, a kind of homogenous group of people. When we do that, we reduce people just to the size of that. So when we're talking about age culturally, it becomes stigmatized because it's devalued. So we shouldn't really be surprised when we discover that jobs in aged care are devalued. The people who work in aged care are devalued. The care homes are devalued. Not because they're working fantastically important, but because culturally it's just not doing the right things in people's eyes. So we don't give it value. It's not that it's not valuable, we just simply don't give it value. So hold that in mind. So what I want us to do this afternoon is to think about how we can change that perspective and give it its proper value. At the beginning of Michael Verdi is a filmmaker kind of guy who does some really interesting work on dementia. He's got a new video called Love is Listening. And right at the beginning of that video, there's a little encounter between this lady here and Naomi Frey, who's just off the picture there. And the woman's obviously been having a conversation about something important. And the woman who is living with advanced dementia, she says to Naomi, she says, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I am. And then she looks up and says, and I don't know where I'm going. Then she looks back at Naomi Frey and says, but your face is a picture of love. It's a beautiful scene, like. And it's a real challenge with it, because when somebody looks at your face, do they see love? Is your face a picture of love? And I think there's something really powerful with that. I want to draw us back, oddly enough, to think about love as a central principle for the ways in which we engage with the kind of issues that we're looking at. So, I want us to think really about the journey of life. There's three dimensions of the journey of life, if you like. Love, care, and healing. I think all three of these dimensions, many other dimensions of the journey of life, but these are the three I want us to focus on: love, care, and healing, because they're inextricably interconnected. They really hold together for the kind of things, enable the kind of things that we've been talking about over the past couple of days. So, the theological point for reflection is this. God is love. There's something very, very important with that. At the centre of the universe is the principle of love. So the reason that anything exists is because of love. And so therefore the reason that anything emerges from that is for the purposes of love. It's a very simple principle. When you think how complicated our understanding of the way the world is, if you narrow it down to the idea that we're here to love, then suddenly it gets a little bit simpler. Not easier, but simpler. There's a little passage in the Gospels where Jesus talks about being wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Martin Luther King picks up on that, and he says this: we must combine the toughness of the serpent and the softness of the dove, a tough mind and a tender heart. And I want us to think about love in that way. In order to love one another, you need to have a tough mind and a tender heart. These two things are really important. Because love is one of these ideas that, it's kind of, we use the language a lot. Like, I love ice cream, I love my mother, I love going to work. But we rarely sit down and think about what that means. And one way we can do that is by thinking about these two dimensions: tough-mindedness and tender-heartedness. So one of the things that the Commission has noted, and that was mentioned there, is consecutive governments have made promises to sort out social care and to fund things properly. And consecutive governments, from Tony Blair through to Boris Johnson, it's not a single party issue, have failed to do so. Now you have to ask, why is that? Because it's not really just a shortage of money. You have to ask the question, do people really want it? Is it really a good investment politically to look after people with mental health challenges, to look after people who are aging, to look after people with dementia? And the answer is, do we vote according to that? Now, is it important as citizens of the country? Is it important to the government? And what the Commission wants to do is tease that out, begin to see, well, perhaps it's not important to government, but it certainly is important to society, so therefore how do we put pressure from the perspective of the Church of England anyway on that. Now, in order to do that, you've got to have a toughness of mind. Because the only reason that the Commission exists is to propagate the love of God. That doesn't mean just being nice to everybody, it means having a tough mind, it means being critical thinking. It means when a government or anybody says, I'm going to do this, and then doesn't do it, and somebody without a tough mind will say, okay, maybe they'll do it eventually. But somebody with a tough mind will say, hold them to account. Why are they not doing it? What's the critical thinking that's necessary to expose this? So in that sense, tough-mindedness is like it's similar to the kind of prophetic ministry, the way the prophets were. They call governments and powers attention to particular issues and call our attention to inattentiveness within government. So the danger of the same old thinking brings about the same results. What the Commission wants to do is to have new thinking. It's called reimagine for a reason. New thinking brings about different results. So tender-heartedness needs to go hand in hand with tough-mindedness. If you're just tough-minded, if you just critical all the time, then you'll do good things, but you won't do everything that's necessary to love. So tender-heartedness is a way of being in the world where we reveal the tender heart of God through our actions. And there's a lovely spiritual tradition which is run across a number of traditions. It's called the sacrament of the present moment. And I always find it really, really interesting because the sacrament of the present moment means that you recognise that every breath that's given to you is a gift. But if you slow down and begin to think every breath that's given to you is a gift, then you begin to live gratefully. And when you begin to live gratefully, you slow down and take time for those things that the world considers to be unimportant. And if you spend time with people with advanced dementia, you can begin to see how that works itself out. But sometimes, when you're with people with advanced dementia, there are moments when you are with them in a different way, where you just lock in and when you begin to see things differently. You know, even if it's just for a second, you know that there's something else that's happening in the midst of that. That takes a certain kind of tender-heartedness and a certain kind of timefulness, an ability to be with people in that particular way. When you do that, then you can begin to see fantastic things. The problem is we're often too busy to notice these things. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So, tough-mindedness, fundamentally important. So the political structures that we're talking into, the way society is structured, where relationships and community are, fundamentally important. But also, tender-heartedness is absolutely necessary. If we separate either of these, then we're not liable to make the kind of change that we want to. So this is how I'd like us to think about love this afternoon. Love is when you say to the other person, it's good that you are here, and I'm glad that you exist. Simple as that. Say it to the person beside you, it's good that you're here, and I'm glad that you exist. So, as soon as you say that, right, you smile. And as soon as you say that, you're in community. And as soon as you say that, things begin to change. So next time you're feeling cross with somebody, just in your mind at least, it's good that you exist. It's good that you exist. So what I'm thinking about though is when we think about policy development, that should be at the forefront of our mind. When we think about the way in which we structure our day-to-day life within care homes, that should be at the front of our mind. When we structure our day-to-day lives full stop, that should be at this front. So that's, get out a t-shirt and wear it to work. Okay, so I want us to think about care. And we start a little passage here, it's quite interesting. Matthew says, Jesus says, I am gentle. So Jesus, who is God, who creates the whole universe, says, I am gentle. So there's a gentleness at the heart of the universe, which I think is really good. I mean, I don't know how gentle you all are, but could you imagine what it would be like to do politics gently, to do church politics gently, or to do policy development gently? It's ridiculous, and yet it would be beautiful. It's not impossible. Anyway, so care. In the book of Genesis, there's two creation stories. First one, God creates the world and says, control it, hold it down, have dominion over it. It's kind of like for dominus. And you can see the mess we've made of the world. I'm taking that to its extreme. But the second creation story is really, really interesting because God creates a human being and says, care and tend for the world. There's two things that you want to think about in there. One, if you read that story, it's a really interesting story. God's up to his elbows in the earth. God loves the world in that sense, like, you know. And we're thinking a lot about ecological issues. That passage there is really, really important. Because when we think about climate change, when we think about the way in which we're destroying the world, who is the most vulnerable people to these things? People with disabilities, people who are poor, people who are late aging. So the kind of things that we were talking about today are fundamental to that ecological conversation. We haven't got time to do that today, but remember that's something, when we talk about climate change, we're not talking about a particular group of people who are just running around, drawing our attention to in annoying ways. We're actually talking about something that's fundamental to those of us who care for those who are marginalised, those who are aging, those who are living with disabilities. But the second thing is, this is the important thing for today, the fundamental calling of human beings is to care for the world, to care for one another. It's written into the foundations of that creation story. If that's the case, then a necessary or obvious corollary is that to be cared for is part of being a human being. So to care and to be cared for are part of being a human being. Now we tend to think very often culturally, both of these things are a sign of weakness, but actually not, they're a sign of our humanness. So when it comes to that time in your life where you can no longer do anything other than be cared for, you don't lose your dignity, you don't lose your value, you actually discover something about being human that you've forgotten. That to be cared for is what we do. We care for one another, we receive care. So it's something that's fundamentally important. And that valuing of being cared for is really important when you're beginning to think about end-of-life issues, thinking around issues of euthanasia and these kinds of questions. That there's a kind of clue in the tradition that says, maybe not, maybe dignity is more than simply independence and power. So, love is central to the issue of care. But it's complicated because care is, the way we describe care is kind of unusual. I did a piece of research for Aberdeen City Council a couple of years ago, looking at their dementia services. They wanted me to just try to develop some creative possibilities for dementia care. And it was very interesting. I learned two things. One, that if you do work for the council, it sits in a shelf for years afterwards, nobody reads it. But I also discovered that this is important, I think. The way in which care is commissioned is on the basis of quality of care. So there are certain criteria that you have to meet. So people have to be safe, warm, well fed, and so on and so forth. So that care dimension that is there, and that care dimension is assessed. And that's a good thing. You always need quality of care. However, quality of life is an optional extra. So as long as you provide that basic care, you have no requirement to think about quality of life, so relationships, meaning, purpose, and so on. Things that make your lives worthwhile are kind of not central to that. Which means that you have a very instrumental understanding of care within the way in which we do policy. So care is presumed to be something that's very basic. So the complexities of real life are not factored into the policy development dimension. And so therefore, you get a thin description of what care is. And so it's not surprising really that it just becomes another thing you have to do, rather than something that's fundamentally important for the people that are being cared for. And that's because the way in which we describe it in terms of policy very often just gives that kind of thin instrumental description. So you can't love without caring, but you can certainly care without loving. One of the blockages to the caring with tenderness and to that kind of dynamic of the sacrament of the present moment is our busyness. One of the things that's it's obvious is that culture values busyness. And you can see that very often when people retire. You'll say, what do you do with your retirement? And they say, I'm as busy as ever. I think, why? When I retire, I don't be as busy as ever. And the reason I'm busy as ever is because that's where you get your sense of fulfillment. That's where you get your sense of value. You're working, you're busy, but I'm not working, I'm just as busy. So you get a culture of busyness that makes it difficult to be still and silent, and to make it very difficult to retire. I don't know if you've ever thought about retirement as a spiritual problem. So if you think about spirituality tries to answer the big questions in life. Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And why? Who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going to? And why? So where do you answer these questions in a, if you like, for many people, a post-religious capitalist society? Well, you do it through work. Work's the place of where I come from, where am I going to, and why. That's the place where you get your sense of identity. I am. Most people you ask, what are you? They'll tell you what you do, which has become part of your identity. And so that a really close connection between your identity and the political and economic situation in which you live. So when you retire, it's a crisis. Because one day you're a bank manager, next day you're not. One day you're a bus driver, next day you're not. So who are you? Harriet Mowat, she says that you should be preparing for your retirement in your early 50s. Otherwise you'll wake up one day and have no idea who you are, and it'll be a crisis. And you know what? It's true. It's very true. And so when work becomes spiritual in that way, then retirement's a problem. How do you fill that gap? By becoming busy. So busyness becomes a kind of pseudo-spirituality in that sense. It gives you that sense of purpose and meaning. So which raises an interesting question in relation to care. There was a study a few years ago, many years ago, it was in the 70s actually, at Princeton Theological Seminary. It's called the Good Samaritan Experiment. And in Princeton's Theological Seminary, you've got the seminary over here, and then a beautiful big campus, and then the chapel over here. And before you get to the chapel, you have to go through this archway, which is very picturesque. So a group of psychologists decided that they would experiment to see, this is what they did. They took two groups of seminarians and gave them, this is the passage to preach to. But under the arch, as you're going through the arch and into the chapel, they put an actor who was pretending to be damaged or hurt or broken. And they said to the first group of students, you've got to get across the chapel because you're late. And so they ran across the chapel, ignored this guy sitting under there, ran into the chapel to preach on the Good Samaritan. And they said to the other guys, you've plenty of time, off you go. So they went across, and they noticed this guy, and they stopped, and they tried to help him. And the conclusion of the study was that speed kills compassion. Busyness kills compassion. Let me read you something. Being busy has become a status symbol, and most people keep encouraging each other to keep their body and mind in constant motion. From a distance, it appears that we try to keep each other filled with words and actions without tolerance for a moment's silence. Hosts often feel that they have to talk all the time to their guests and entertain them with things to do, places to see, people to visit. But by filling up every empty corner and occupying every empty time, their hospitality became more oppressive than revealing. So this point is, when you're so busy, when you're ruled by time in that way, then it becomes difficult to be present. And when you're not present, all sorts of unpleasant things happen. I had the good fortune of spending a year in Australia, living in Sydney, just before the pandemic. Had to rush back before the airport shut down. I was working with an organisation over there that specialises in dementia care. An organisation called Hammond Care. The Australians had a royal commission a few years ago that really looked at the way in which care home staff were abusive to people who were in the facilities. And the general consensus seems to be that it wasn't deliberate, it wasn't that these were unpleasant people that were doing unpleasant things, although they were doing unpleasant things. It was that they weren't noticing. And so they'd be in a situation where, for example, they'd be helping somebody to get dressed or whatever, they'd be talking over them, or they'd be on their phone, and as soon as they were present but completely absent. And when you get that sense of presence and absence, then the possibility of abuse happens because you don't notice things. And you also get a culture where not noticing these things becomes the norm. And when that happens, then you have difficulty. So central to care is the idea of presence. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but we live in a culture that is rapidly becoming more and more absent. Let me read this to you. We check our phones every 12 minutes during waking hours. I'm sure you guys don't, but some people do. 7% of us say that we never turn off our phone. 40% of us check our phones within 5 minutes of waking. Interestingly, a recent study noted that those people who are distracted by emails and phone calls saw a 10-point fall in their IQ, which was twice that found in studies on the impact of smoking marijuana. So you better smoke marijuana than to use Google. Don't quote me on that one. Well, you can't feel it. So this is the important point. A lack of presence is rapidly becoming a cultural norm. When this implicit cultural norm is transferred into an aged care setting, problems will inevitably arise. And so social media is programmed, in that sense, to be absence. Absence becomes the norm. Take that into aged care situation and you get a real difficulty. So what we concluded was that one way in which care home staff can begin to get past this sense of absence is very simply to have small laminated cards in their pocket, right? And this is how they run. Stop, think, breathe, look again. Stop, take a moment to step back from what you're doing. Think about the person before you. Breathe, take a deep breath and relax. Look again at what you are doing and how you want to do it. Now, there's a lot of interesting evidence that suggests that taking micro breaks in a busy day actually improves performance, but it also means that you see things differently. If you step out of the situation, even if it's a busy situation, even for a few moments, and then step back in again, then you see things differently. So getting into that rhythm of stepping out and stepping in is actually really, really important. So it may not be possible for us to change the structure of a busy day, but it is possible to step out and step in. And when you do that, you begin to shift your perspective on time. Because in order to be tender, in order to begin to think about being present, we need to have a particular understanding of time. Think about the way that time works in our lives. We buy time, we lose time, we waste time, we use time. Everything you do with your money, you do with your time. So it becomes a commodity. It becomes something that is just there for the sake of doing something else. But if you reclaim time and slow down a bit, then these other things are possibilities. Kusuke Kiyama, who's a Japanese, or was a Japanese theologian, wrote a really interesting essay back in the 60s called The 3 Mile an Hour God. He noticed that the average speed that a human being walks at is 3 miles per hour. So Jesus, who is God, walks at 3 miles per hour. God, who is love, walks at 3 miles per hour. And then he says, so love has a speed. Love has a speed. It's a spiritual speed. It's a different kind of speed from the technological speed to which we're accustomed. It goes on in the depth of our life, whether we have noticed it or not, at 3 miles an hour. It's the speed we walk, and therefore the speed the love of God walks. In other words, in order to love, you need to learn how to slow down. That doesn't mean you escape from busyness, but it does mean you have to learn how to slow down even in the midst of the busyness that you are. And that's stepping out, stepping out. There's at least one way in which we can do that. Reimagining the healing. So we looked at love, we looked at care, and finally we want to look at the issue of healing. And by healing I don't mean curing. So sometimes when we're talking about healing we get confused between healing and curing. And so the image I wanted to think about here is, within the Bible, there's no such word for health as we understand it, the absence of illness. This doesn't exist. The closest word to health is the idea of shalom, which you probably used before in terms of peace. But shalom means justice, righteousness. In other words, it's a political dimension to it. Justice, righteousness, being with those who are oppressed. But ultimately it means being in the presence of God. So to be healthy is to do justice, to do righteousness, and to be in the presence of God, to be in the presence of others. So you could be at the end of your life dying of whatever you would be dying of, and you could be really healthy because you'd be able to sustain these things, these kinds of relational things. And you could be the most fantastic Olympian ever and be really unhealthy because you don't have any of these things. You're a hedonist, the only thing that matters is me. So within that understanding, you begin to see that healing has to do with connection. It's not to do with eradication of any particular thing that's wrong with it. It's to do with connection and sustaining connection in the midst of that. And that's really important. So we're talking about, Jesus says that the sum of the law and promise to love God, love neighbour, and love self. So to be fulfilled is to enter into that kind of relationship. You're held together in that way. That's really important when we're thinking about aging, and particularly when we begin to talk about dementia. Because within our culture, we tend to think that your identity, your sense of self, is just incorporated within yourself, right? So I'm independent, I'm strong, I'm competitive. And so everything that you are is held within yourself. Now, the pandemic's begun to open up. It's pretty clear that we're not independent in that way. But think about it, that's a cultural ideal of what a human being can be, should be. Stephen Sabat, who's a very interesting psychologist, writes about Alzheimer's. He's, in his book, Alzheimer's, the Tangled Web, first of all, he does a really interesting piece of qualitative research for people with dementia. People who are in the early stages of dementia, right through to people who are in end stages or later stages of dementia. And he points out that in each of these stages, people are always there. People are always themselves. People are always able to communicate. Now, it may be that when you go a little bit later in your dementia journey, that you're not able to articulate yourself in the way that you usually do, that you maybe misuse words, but you're always there. And he says that this whole idea that your personhood disappears when you have dementia, he says it's just a mistake. And so he offers a different way of thinking about personhood or identity, who we are. He says there's 3 dimensions, or he says it's a threefold self. He says the first dimension is if you're in the world. right? So if you're a person who's just existing, you don't have to name yourself, but you're here, you feel things, you sense things, you're a person. So the second dimension of the self is your social self. It's the things that you learn over time, the identities that you get over time. So you become a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a banker, a baker, whatever it is. You accrue all of these identities over time. And one of these might be a person with dementia, or an elderly person. But a person with dementia, it says, but for most of the part, when you're in self too, it says, you can kind of negotiate yourself. So if I say to you, you're not who you are, I can say back, I am who I am. If I say to you, you've lost your keys, it's because of your dementia, I can say, no, it's not, I've lost my keys since I was 12, or whatever it is. So you're always able to tell different stories that counter it is. However, when it comes to a stigmatized condition like dementia or like aging, people stop listening to your story. And so it becomes more and more difficult to hold on to your identity because people are ascribing everything to your age or to your dementia or to something else. And eventually you begin to lose that power to tell your own story. And then it says self-3 is something different. It says self-3 is always a gift. It's something that's given to you. It's that gift of friendship, that gift of value, that gift of personhood, of recognising who you are. It's given to you by your community. If your community doesn't do that, then you can lose your personhood. But you lose your personhood because your community has lost you, not because of anything that's happened to you. So he says that human beings are always persons in relationship. We become who we are in relationship, which resonates with that idea of shalom. But it raises the issue of loneliness. If we become who we are, in and through our relationships, then loneliness becomes a profoundly devastating condition. Not just because you feel lost or feel relationally broken, you actually begin to lose something important. I came across this study which I'll share a little bit about. So this was a study from a few years ago, looking at loneliness, the relationship between loneliness and dementia. So, it was a 2007 article in the Archives of General Psychiatry, and it's focused on the role of loneliness in the development of Alzheimer's. So it indicated that people who are lonely are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And this is the interesting bit. It says, there are two ideas that we should take away from it. It says, number one is it suggests that loneliness really is a risk factor. So being lonely is a risk factor for Alzheimer's. And secondly, in trying to understand the association, we need to look outside the typical neuropathology. So the results ruled out the possibility that loneliness is a reaction to dementia. It may be that loneliness may affect systems in the brain dealing with cognition and memory, making lonely people more vulnerable to effects of age-related decline in neural pathways. We need to be aware that loneliness doesn't just have an emotional impact, but a physical impact. In other words, if somebody is isolated and alienated, they're going to be much more prone because your brain needs to be spoken to before it can continue to develop. Your brain's plastic. It requires relationship, it requires to be spoken to, it requires other people to continue to develop. And so the idea of loneliness actually is not just a social relational thing, but possibly a biological thing. So, the gift of time is healing. Because the solution to that is fairly straightforward. Speak to people, visit people, recognise those who are lonely, and offer the gift of friendship and the gift of time, the way that we've been talking about. Because ultimately, when it comes to mental health, relationships are antidepressants. There's a lot of very interesting research that looks at the way in which community protects people from depression. So the fact that you enter into a relationship, give people the gift of time, give people the gift of healing, has significant mental health implications, which are maybe more poignant through the pandemic. So, coming to the end of what I want to say to you. There's two concepts that I want you to finish with. The first is the idea of homefulness. And I think that's very, very important. Because where is your home? Homefulness is that idea that you feel at home in the space that you are. So where is your home? And your home is where your heart is. Where is your heart? The place that you feel most comfortable with. Right? That could be in a care home, it could be in your own home, it could be wherever it is. But searching after homefulness, and it's always interesting to me how when you take somebody who's living with dementia in particular, but probably anybody, from their home and place them in a care home, for many people their behaviour changes completely. And people say, well, it's just a dementia, or it's just whatever it is. It's not, it's because they've lost the sense of homefulness. And when you lose your sense of homefulness, you don't know your place in the universe anymore. And if you don't know your place in the universe, you'll be anxious, you'll be perhaps aggressive, and rather than pathologizing that, think about that, homefulness. This person is looking for home. And the second idea is belonging. I think that both love, care, and healing requires a particular kind of community. It's not a community that is simply inclusive of elderly people, but a place where people belong. One of the interesting debates within disability studies is the tension between inclusion and belonging. So inclusion is a political term that means that you have to be, legislation says you have to include people in this community because it's illegal not to do so. You don't have to love them or care for them, you just have to get them inside and include them. Belonging means that you have to care. The way that you know that you belong to a community is if somebody misses you. If nobody misses you, you may be included, but you don't belong. So what we're called to, this is probably one of the most fundamental things that the Commission wants to think about is how do we form communities of belonging within which people with mental health challenges, people with disabilities, elderly people, all of us together can find a place of belonging. A place of homefulness and a place of belonging. So the solution to the problem is simple. Love, care, healing, kindness, thoughtfulness, critical thinking, and the creation of communities of belonging. And in one sense it is simple, because basically that's what it takes to love your neighbour. And certainly for those of us who are developing faith communities, that idea of loving your neighbour is central. So the question is how we do that, but the actual issue, the actual challenge is straightforward. So that's me finished. It's good that you exist, you're here, and I'm glad that you exist. And it's good that you're, although, when I said that earlier on, not one of you said it to me. So,
it's good that you're
it's too late now. I don't take any respect for that man. So, you're not, we haven't really formed a community of belonging when one person is rejected. Anyway, thank you for listening.